My grandson said I smelled old. I showed him who paid his tuition. The clinking of dishes was the only sound in the little kitchen that night. I had spent the afternoon preparing his favorite meal, chicken stew with soft dumplings, just the way he used to like it when he was a boy. I even wore the blue dress he once called my lucky dress, the one I wore to his first school play. It was faded now, the fabric thin at the elbows, but I ironed it carefully, smoothing the wrinkles with a shaky hand. Before he arrived, I dabbed on a touch of perfume. Not too much, just one spritz behind the ears, the same bottle I had owned for years. It reminded me of my youth, of nights when his grandfather would take me dancing. My heart fluttered when I heard the front door slam. He was home. My grandson. My pride. My boy who had grown so tall, so smart, so sure of himself. "Dinner's ready," I called softly, wiping my hands on a towel. He walked in, tossing his bag on the couch, phone in hand, not even glancing up. College had made him busier, harder to reach. I told myself he was just tired. Young men had a lot on their shoulders these days. Still I smiled. "Sit down, dear. I made the stew you love." He slid into the chair, scrolling on his phone. I set a bowl in front of him, steam curling upward like a promise. As I leaned closer to place the spoon beside him, I caught it. A wrinkle in his nose. Sharp exhale. And then, under his breath, words he didn't think I'd hear. "God, Grandma smells old." My hand froze. The spoon clattered against the bowl. I looked at him, at the boy I had rocked to sleep in my arms, whose tiny hand once clutched my finger like it was the whole world, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. He didn't look up. He just kept scrolling, tapping, grinning at something on the glowing screen. The room shrank around me. My ears rang. I wanted to ask if I heard correctly, but my throat was too dry. Instead, I lowered myself into the chair opposite him, trying to hide the way my hands trembled. The stew sat untouched between us, steam slowly dying. Every bite I forced into my mouth tasted of salt, though I hadn't added much that night. He never noticed. Later, when the dishes were washed and he had retreated to his room, I sat in the silence of my own. My mirror reflected a woman I sometimes didn't know. Silver hair escaping its bun. Wrinkles deepened by years of worry. Was this what he saw? Just an old smell, instead of the woman who once carried him on her back to the clinic when he had a fever? I pressed my hands to my face, willing the tears not to fall. I told myself it was just an offhand comment, a careless slip. But words, once spoken, never vanish. They cling to the walls. They echo in the heart. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house breathe. The pipes creaked. The wind tapped at the window. And over it all, the words repeated. "Grandma smells old." I turned to the wall and wept quietly, my pillow catching every sound I dared not let escape. Because the truth was simple, and it cut deeper than anything else. I wasn't hurt because he thought I smelled old. I was hurt because he had forgotten everything I had done to make sure he had a future. And I wondered, was this what love turned into after all the years of sacrifice? I wasn't always this old woman he sneered at. Once, I was a young mother with fire in my bones and calluses on my hands. Life never gave me much. When my husband passed suddenly, just a heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday, I was left with a 5-year-old boy and a pile of unpaid bills. There was no insurance, no savings account, no soft cushion to fall on. Just me. I remember standing in that tiny kitchen back then, staring at the cracked linoleum floor, whispering to myself, "You will not let him go hungry. You will not let him fall." And I didn't. I worked mornings at a diner, refilling coffee cups for truck drivers who barely looked me in the eye. I worked evenings sewing hems, patching jeans, fixing torn jackets for neighbors who sometimes paid in coins, sometimes in bread. And at night, when the world slept, I whispered stories to my boy in the dark, promising him a future brighter than mine. He grew up strong. Smart. He wanted more, and I wanted it for him. I sold my wedding jewelry to pay for his first semester at university. I never told him. It wasn't his burden to carry. But my hands remember the sting of those sacrifices. The nights I came home from the diner with blisters from scrubbing greasy pans. The mornings I wrapped my feet in cloth before slipping them into shoes because new ones were out of reach. All of it for him. When my grandson was born, the fire lit inside me all over again. A little boy with his father's eyes and my husband's mischievous grin. From the moment I first held him, warm and squirming, I swore I would give him the world. I babysat him while my son and his wife worked. I cooked, cleaned, sang lullabies until my throat ached. I walked miles pushing his stroller, saving every cent by refusing taxis, even buses. When he was sick with the flu at 4 years old, I stayed up 3 nights straight, wiping his forehead with a cool rag, whispering prayers with every breath. I begged heaven to spare him, to take my strength if it meant giving him life. He was mine as much as theirs, in every way that mattered. But love sometimes turns invisible when the years pile up. Children grow. They forget the arms that carried them, the hands that washed their shirts, the heart that stayed awake when theirs was weak. Now when he looks at me, he sees only wrinkles. Only gray hair. He doesn't see the woman who skipped meals so he could eat. He doesn't see the grandmother who whispered, "One more step, you can do it," as he learned to walk. He doesn't see the sacrifices that shaped his life. And maybe that is the way of the world. Maybe we are meant to fade so they can shine. But still, it hurts. It hurts that my grandson, the boy I loved like air, can sit across from me, wrinkle his nose and call me old. That night, after his words cut me open, I sat by the window and thought back on everything. The weight of years pressed heavy on my shoulders, but so did pride. Because if there was one thing I had done right, it was this. I gave my family everything I could. My son's education, his career, my grandson's future, his college tuition, his books, his meals. Yes, I was old. Yes, I smelled of age and sacrifice. But I was also the silent architect of everything they stood on. And I swore, with the moonlight as my witness, that one day, they would remember. The next few days slid by quietly, but the air inside that house never softened. Silence was thicker than conversation. My grandson walked past me with headphones in, thumbs flying across his phone screen, eyes glued to the blue glow. No "good morning, Grandma." No "how was your night?" Just the steady rhythm of footsteps fading down the hall. I told myself he was busy. College papers, friends, maybe even a girlfriend. But in truth, the distance wasn't just distraction. It was a wall. A wall I hadn't built. Dinner times became the stage for little tensions. My daughter-in-law would sigh when I asked if I could help set the table. No, just sit. You'll only slow us down, she'd mutter with a tight smile. Slow them down. I had once cooked feasts with these same hands. I had once carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs without complaint. Now, apparently, I was too slow even to place forks beside plates. So I sat, butching, swallowing the ache in my throat like bitter medicine. One evening, as we gathered for dinner, I brought out a small dish of pickled vegetables, something my grandson used to love as a child. I placed it near his plate, smiling faintly. He barely glanced up before pushing it aside. "I don't eat stuff like that anymore," he muttered. His mother laughed lightly, pouring water into glasses. "He's grown up, Mom. He doesn't need your old-fashioned food." Old-fashioned. The word struck like a pebble tossed into a pond, rippling outward. Everything about me was now old, my cooking, my clothes, my perfume, even my very presence. My son kept his eyes on his plate. Always silent. Always pretending not to hear. I wondered if he remembered the nights I stayed up sewing his school uniform, or the afternoons I skipped meals so he could have lunch money. Did he ever think of those things when he chose silence over defense? That night, when the dishes were cleared, I overheard my grandson in the living room. He was laughing with his friends over video chat, the sound carrying through the thin walls. "She's so old-fashioned," he chuckled. "Like, she smells like mothballs and boiled potatoes. I swear." Laughter erupted on the other end. He joined in. I closed my eyes and pressed my hand to my chest, as if I could hold my heart still before it cracked. The days stacked up like that. Sigh here. Smirk there. 1,000 tiny cuts that bled me dry in silence. Even when I tried to bridge the gap, asking about his classes, his professors, his dreams, he would shrug, offer clipped answers, then return to his glowing screen. The boy who once begged me to tell him bedtime stories now had no use for my voice. The house itself seemed to shift against me. My daughter-in-law redecorated, replacing the old floral curtains I had sewn with sleek gray blinds. The family photos I once hung proudly in the hallway disappeared into boxes, replaced with abstract paintings she bought online. My face, my history was being erased from the walls. Even the smell of the house had changed. Once it was garlic, stew, and fresh bread. Now it was air fresheners, ocean breeze, and lavender mist, masking everything that came from me. It felt like they were scrubbing me out of their lives, bit by bit, until I was nothing but a shadow in the corner. At dinner one evening I asked softly, "How are your grades this semester?" My grandson didn't look up. "Fine." I tried again. "Any classes you're enjoying?" He sighed loudly, dropping his fork onto the plate with a clatter. "Why do you always have to ask so many questions? Can't you just eat quietly?" The words froze me. The room went silent for a moment. My daughter-in-law sipped her wine, smirking into the glass. My son cleared his throat, muttered something about respect, but his voice was weak. And me smiled. A smile that trembled at the corners. And I ate quietly because that was what they wanted. But inside something shifted. They thought I was weak. They thought age had stolen my strength, my dignity, my power. But they had forgotten one thing. I was the reason my grandson sat in those classrooms. I was the one paying silently for every credit, every textbook, every dormitory meal card. And one day soon they would remember. It happened on a Saturday evening, the kind of evening families are supposed to cherish. The house was full. My son had invited a few of his business colleagues, and my grandson brought 2 friends from college. The table was set with polished plates, wine glasses sparkling under the chandelier, and laughter floated around the room like bubbles in a glass. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, arranging dishes, moving quietly, making sure nothing ran out. That's what I had become. A shadowy helper, never the guest of honor, always the servant in my own son's home. Still I smiled. It didn't cost me anything to smile. When it was time to serve the roast, I carried the platter out carefully. My hands, though stiff with age, still knew how to balance weight. I placed the tray at the center of the table, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the air. "Ah, smells good," one of my son's colleagues said. My cheeks warmed at the compliment. It had been a long time since anyone noticed my cooking. But then my grandson laughed. "Careful," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "She smells just like the roast." His friends burst out laughing. Even my daughter-in-law let out a small chuckle, covering it with a sip of wine. The room tilted. My heart pounded in my ears. The roast, perfume, my very being, mocked like a joke in front of strangers. I stood frozen for a moment, the laughter bouncing around the table like cruel echoes. No one stopped him. No one defended me. My son looked down, pretending to butter his bread. Cowardice never looked so sharp on him. I placed the serving spoon gently beside the tray. "Excuse me," I whispered, though my voice shook. No one noticed when I left the room. Back in my small bedroom, I closed the door and leaned against it, finally letting my chest collapse. The tears came hot, burning trails down my cheeks. I pressed a hand over my mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. What kind of family laughs when their grandmother is humiliated? What kind of boy turns his love into mockery? I thought of the nights I held him against my chest, rocking him until dawn. Of the birthdays where I saved coins in a jar just to buy him a toy car. Of the afternoons I stood in the hot sun, waiting outside his school, just to walk him home. All of it, gone, erased with one cruel laugh. Later, when the guests had gone and silence returned to the house, I sat on the edge of my bed. I pulled open the drawer of my nightstand. Inside was a stack of neatly folded envelopes, payment receipts from the university, copies of bank transfers, scholarship contribution letters, proof, evidence, pages that told the real story. Every semester, it was my money that kept him enrolled. Every semester, I cut deeper into my savings, into the tiny inheritance his grandfather left me, just so he could walk through the gates of that university with his head held high. And here he was mocking me, mocking the very hands that had fed and clothed him, the very wallet that still carried him forward. I traced the edges of one receipt with my finger. It felt like tracing the scar of my own heart. That night I made a decision. I had stayed quiet too long. I had endured sighs, smirks, and silence. But there comes a moment when even the softest heart hardens, not out of bitterness but out of survival. I would not scream. I would not beg. But I would make sure he and the whole family finally knew the truth. They wanted me invisible. But I still had power and I still had proof. And I was done hiding both. The receipts lay in my lap like fragile leaves, each one carrying years of sacrifice pressed into ink and numbers. I ran my fingers over the faded print, memories rising with every line of payment. The first tuition installment, $7,000, nearly drained my savings account. I remember sitting at the bank that day, clutching the pen as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. The teller smiled politely as I signed the withdrawal slip, but behind her eyes was a flicker of pity. Old woman giving away what little she had. She didn't know it wasn't just money. It was my blood, my sleep, my dreams. I thought of the ways I scraped it together. Selling the last pieces of gold jewelry my husband had given me. The wedding bangles I once cherished, tucked away in a velvet box. I sold them quietly at a pawn shop, slipping the cash into an envelope before anyone could ask where it came from. I thought of the extra hours at the diner, even when my back screamed and my knees throbbed. The owner let me fill in when others called out, and I never said no. Every tip, every coin dropped into my apron went into a separate jar labeled school fund. And I thought of the medical checkups I skipped, the pills the doctor recommended for my blood pressure, the scans he urged me to get. I convinced myself I didn't need them. Better the boy have books and meals than me have medicine. There were nights when my hands cramped so badly from sewing that I couldn't even button my own blouse. Still, I stitched quietly under the dim bulb, telling myself each finished garment was another step toward his future. And when the envelope was full, I would walk to the bank, slipping it into the account his parents believed they were solely funding. They didn't ask questions. Perhaps they wanted to believe the scholarships covered more than they did. Perhaps they wanted to avoid knowing the truth. But the truth was here, stacked neatly in my drawer. Every semester I filled the gap. Every semester, I made sure no letter of suspension for non-payment ever reached his inbox. I remembered the day he called me after his first semester ended. "Grandma," he said, excitement bubbling in his voice, "I passed all my classes. Thank you for believing in me." Tears rolled down my cheeks that day. He didn't know I had just wired another payment, enough to keep him enrolled for the next semester. I told myself I didn't need his gratitude. His success was enough. But gratitude is not nothing. And now, sitting in that dim room with his cruel laughter still echoing in my ears, I realized how deeply I had craved it all along. I picked up one of the receipts, holding it against my chest. My heart pounded. Not with sorrow this time, but with clarity. These were not just scraps of paper. They were the story of my love, written in dollars and cents. And if my grandson wanted to laugh at me, if he wanted to reduce me to nothing more than a smell, then he needed to know the cost of the life he was living. That night, I stayed awake long after the rest of the house fell silent. I sorted the receipts, placing them in order. Semester 1, Semester 2, Semester 3. I slipped them into a neat folder, my hands trembling not with weakness, but with resolve. For years I had chosen silence. I thought dignity meant hiding my sacrifices, letting them remain invisible. But sometimes dignity means truth. And tomorrow, at breakfast, truth was exactly what I would bring to the table. The morning sun crept through the blinds, painting the dining room in soft gold. The table was set simply: toast, eggs, coffee. My son sat at the head, scanning his phone as usual. My daughter-in-law buttered her bread with the sharp movements of someone already irritated by the day. And my grandson. He strolled in late, yawning, muttering something about late-night studying. No one noticed the folder in my hands. No one noticed the weight in my eyes. I took my seat quietly, the folder resting on my lap like a secret waiting to breathe. For a moment I just listened, to the clinking of cutlery, the casual chatter, the soft hum of a house that thought it knew its rhythm. And then, I placed the folder on the table. The sound was soft, just a thud of paper against wood. But in the silence that followed, it was louder than thunder. My daughter-in-law frowned. "What's this?" My son glanced up, distracted. "Mom, we're eating." But I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the folder and spread the papers across the table like cards in a game. Receipts, transfers, bank slips, each one sliding into the light, undeniable. "What are you doing?" my grandson asked, his voice laced with annoyance. I finally looked at him. Really looked. And with a steadiness I didn't know I still had, I spoke. "The woman you said smelled old," I began, my voice low but sharp, "is the reason you sit in those classrooms today." The room froze. My grandson blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" I tapped the first receipt. "Tuition. Paid by me." Another paper. "Books. Paid by me." Another. "Meal card. Paid by me." One by one I laid them bare. His eyes darted over the pages, disbelief spreading like cracks in glass. My son's fork clattered against his plate. My daughter-in-law's smirk faltered, replaced by wide-eyed silence. I pressed my palm flat against the stack, grounding myself. "For years I have sold, worked and sacrificed so that you," I turned to my grandson, "could have a future." The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, begging for comfort, now sat stiff and pale. His lips parted, but no words came. "You mocked me," I continued, my voice trembling but unbroken. "You laughed at me in front of strangers. You wrinkled your nose like I was nothing but a burden in this house. But every step you've taken on that campus has been carried by me." Tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not cry. Not today. "You think I smell of age. I smell of sacrifice. I smell of sleepless nights, skipped meals, and hard work that you will never know." The words hung heavy in the air. No one dared to speak. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "Mom, you should have told us." I cut her off with a raised hand. I owed you no explanations. My love was not a debt to be flaunted. But make no mistake. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my grandson. "Your education exists because of me. And I will not sit quietly while you reduce me to a smell." Silence. Uncomfortable. My son rubbed his forehead, shame painted across his face. I didn't know," he murmured. "You didn't ask," I replied softly. My grandson pushed back from the table, his chair screeching against the floor. His face was red, a storm of humiliation and anger brewing in his eyes. Why didn't you say anything before?" he snapped, voice cracking. "Because love doesn't announce itself," I said simply. "But disrespect forces the truth to speak." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. The house that once hummed with laughter now held its breath. Finally, I gathered the papers, sliding them back into the folder. My hands shook, but not from fear. From finality. I stood, placing the folder under my arm. And as I left the room, I whispered the words that had burned in my chest for weeks. "I am not ashamed of being old. But you should be ashamed of forgetting who made you who you are." And then I walked away, leaving the silence to choke them. The silence after my words clung to the walls like smoke. When I walked back to my room, I could still feel it pressing against my back. Thick, heavy, suffocating. I closed the door softly behind me, the folder of receipts still under my arm. For the first time in weeks, I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing slowly, feeling the strange weight of dignity return to my chest. But in the dining room, the silence cracked. My grandson shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the wooden floor. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice breaking between anger and shame. "She's just trying to make me feel guilty. Why would she pay for everything? My parents." My son cut him off, his voice low, guilt-ridden. "Because I couldn't, that's why. The business was struggling. The scholarships weren't enough. And your grandmother." His words caught. "She stepped in without a word." My grandson stared, confusion warring with denial. She really did all that." My daughter-in-law, usually quick with her tongue, said nothing. Her wine glass trembled slightly in her hand as the truth sank in. Later that day, I heard their voices through the walls. Arguments hushed at first, then sharper. "My son. We should have known. How could we let her carry that alone?" My daughter-in-law. "Don't put this on me. She chose not to tell anyone. Besides, it's not like she doesn't get a roof over her head here." Roof. Was that how they measured me now? 4 walls and a ceiling, as if I hadn't poured my entire life into theirs. I lay back on my pillow, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, and wondered if love meant so little in this house. My grandson didn't speak to me for 2 days. He walked past my door, his footsteps quick, head lowered. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of him. His jaw tight, his eyes avoiding mine. But avoidance is not silence. Avoidance is loud. Screams of guilt. I carried on quietly, tending the small garden in the backyard, trimming the roses his grandfather once planted. It was peaceful there, among the thorns and petals. At least the roses didn't forget the hand that watered them. On the 3rd night, as I was folding laundry, my son knocked gently at my door. He stood in the doorway, eyes heavy, his shoulders slumped. "Mom," he said softly. "I'm sorry." I looked at him, my boy grown into a man who had forgotten how to defend me, and for a moment I saw the child he once was, standing there with scraped knees, waiting for me to make the pain disappear. "You don't need to apologize," I whispered. "Yes, I do," he insisted. "I should have spoken up. I should have noticed. You carried everything while I just looked away." His voice cracked, and for the first time in years, he looked small again. I reached out, resting my wrinkled hand on his. "You were busy building your own life. I didn't want to be a burden." He shook his head. "You were never a burden. I made you feel like one. And I won't let it happen again." That night I slept a little lighter. But the wound from my grandson's words still pulsed, deep and tender. It wasn't enough for my son to see. The boy who mocked me had to face what he had done. And in time he would. Because guilt has a way of crawling into the heart, whispering louder than pride. The next morning I heard my grandson's voice through the kitchen door. Low, frustrated, defensive. "She embarrassed me in front of everyone. Why would she bring it up like that?" My daughter-in-law murmured something I couldn't catch. And then my son's reply, firm this time. "She told the truth. And you laughed at her, humiliated her. You owe her respect. And an apology." My heart ached as I stood there in the hallway, clutching the edge of the wall for balance. Not because of the argument, but because maybe, just maybe, the lesson had finally begun to sink in. The days after the confrontation stretched out like a quiet road after a storm. No more laughter at my expense. No more smirks. No more whispered remarks about how I smelled or how I cooked. Instead, there was a strange hush in the house. A hush made of guilt. Of people avoiding the mirror because they didn't like what stared back at them. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space. I began spending more hours in the garden. The roses bloomed red and full, their scent rich and alive, proof that not all smells of age were unpleasant. As I clipped away dead petals and tied the stems upright, I felt lighter. For years I had poured myself into everyone else. Cooking, cleaning, paying, sacrificing. But in those quiet mornings among the flowers, I remembered I was more than just someone's mother, someone's grandmother. I was a woman who had lived. A woman who had survived loss, hardship, humiliation, and was still standing. I tended my roses not for them but for me. 'Cause I loved them. Because they reminded me that even beauty with thorns has worth. Sometimes I walked to the park nearby. I sat on benches and watched children chase pigeons, watched young couples argue and make up, watched old friends laugh together like time had never touched them. It was strange. How the world outside my house still had joy, still had space for me. I had been so wrapped in trying to keep my family's foundation steady that I had forgotten the world had other rooms for me to breathe in. I even joined a little reading circle at the library. Mostly other women my age, some widowed, some divorced, all carrying their own stories like weathered handbags. We read poetry aloud, sometimes novels. And when I spoke, no one laughed at the sound of my voice. Inside the house, things shifted slowly. My daughter-in-law no longer smirked. She avoided my eyes, moving around me like one avoids a fragile vase they don't know how to handle. My son treated me with a softness I hadn't seen in years, asking if I needed anything, checking if I was comfortable. And my grandson, he avoided me at first. His footsteps quickened whenever he passed my door. But avoidance is just guilt's shadow. It grows darker the longer you run from it. Sometimes I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye. When I brought in fresh flowers from the garden. When I returned from the library, books tucked under my arm. When I hummed softly to myself in the kitchen while brewing tea. He looked at me differently. Not with disgust, but with something he didn't yet know how to name. One night, as I sat at the table alone with my tea, I thought back on everything. The insults, the silence, the humiliation at that dinner party. And I realized something important. I wasn't waiting for their respect anymore. Respect is precious, yes. But dignity. Dignity is something you can carry in your own pocket. No one can steal it from you unless you let them. That night, I whispered a promise to myself. I would not shrink to fit their blindness anymore. If they couldn't see my worth, I would not beg them to. And yet, deep inside, the wound of my grandson's words still lingered. Because it was his voice, not his mother's or even my son's, that had cut me deepest. The boy I once carried, the boy who once called me my best friend, had grown into a man who forgot. Forgot love. Forgot sacrifice. Forgot me. But maybe forgetting was not permanent. Maybe guilt would turn into recognition. Maybe shame would turn into repentance. And if it did, I would be ready. Not as a woman crushed by his insult, but as a woman standing tall in her truth. It was late on a Wednesday when the knock came. 3 soft taps at my door. Hesitant, uneven, almost childlike. I looked up from the sweater I was mending, my needle pausing midair. "Come in," I said gently. The door creaked open and there he was, my grandson. His hair was tousled, his face pale. His eyes red-rimmed as if sleep had avoided him for nights. For a moment he stood frozen, his hand still gripping the doorknob like a lifeline. "Grandma," he whispered. Not hey, not hi, but the word I had been aching to hear without bitterness. He shuffled in, closing the door softly behind him. I could see the battle in his face, pride wrestling with guilt, anger warring with shame. Finally, he dropped into the chair across from me, elbows on his knees, his head hanging low. I need to say something," he muttered, his voice cracking. I set my sewing aside and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't rush him. I knew apologies, real ones, take time to climb from the heart to the mouth. "I was wrong," he blurted suddenly. The words spilled out raw, sharp like glass breaking. His hands trembled as he rubbed them over his face. "I shouldn't have said what I said. I shouldn't have laughed. God, Grandma, I—" His voice faltered, and he pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, hiding the tears that threatened. I was stupid. I thought it was funny. I thought my friends would think I was cool. But all I did was hurt you. And you didn't deserve that. Not after everything you've done for me." He finally lifted his eyes to mine. Wet, red, but honest. "I don't even know why you'd still want to look at me." My chest ached, but not with anger. With something heavier. Something softer. I leaned forward, my wrinkled hand reaching across the small table. He flinched at first, as if he didn't deserve my touch, but then let me rest my hand over his trembling fingers. "Do you know what hurt me the most?" I asked quietly. He shook his head, shame burning his cheeks. "That you forgot," I whispered. "Forgot the nights I held you through fevers. Forgot the mornings I walked you to school. Forgot the sacrifices I made. Not for praise but because I loved you. That's what broke my heart, my boy. Not the smell. Not the laughter. But the forgetting." Tears spilled down his face, fast now, uncontrollable. He dropped his head into his hands, shoulders shaking. "I didn't forget," he sobbed. I took it all for granted. I thought you'd always be there, always forgiving, always quiet. I was selfish. And cruel." I squeezed his hand, my own eyes brimming. "You are young. Youth makes fools of us all. But listen to me." I lifted his chin gently until his eyes met mine. "You are not too far gone to change." For a long moment we just sat there, my frail hand wrapped around his tears dripping onto the wooden table between us. Finally he whispered, "Can you forgive me?" I smiled through my own tears. "Forgiveness is easy, my dear. It is respect that must be earned." He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Then I'll earn it. I swear, Grandma, I'll make it right. I'll never treat you like that again." The words weren't perfect. They were clumsy, halting. But they were real. And for me that was enough. I reached out, pulling him into my arms. He stiffened at first. Grown men aren't used to being held like children. But then his body sagged against mine, heavy with relief. For the first time in years, I held him the way I used to. In that quiet room, with no audience and no performance, I felt the boy I had raised return to me. Not as a child, but as a man humbled by love. And I knew then that the wound he had left in me would scar, yes, but it would also heal. Because he finally remembered. The weeks that followed were different. Not perfect, not magical, but different. My grandson began to linger in the kitchen when I cooked. He asked questions, not the clipped, impatient kind but real ones. "How do you season the stew like that? Can you show me how you roll dumplings?" Sometimes he simply sat at the table with his books open, studying while I hummed softly by the stove. It wasn't grand. It wasn't flashy. But it was presence. And presence, after absence, is its own form of apology. One Saturday morning he surprised me. "Grandma," he said, shuffling nervously, "my university is hosting an alumni lecture this week. Students can bring family members. Will you come with me?" I blinked at him, unsure I'd heard right. "Me? Why would you want?" "Because you belong there," he cut in quickly, his voice firm. "Because every step I take there is yours too." My throat tightened. I nodded, unable to form words. On the day of the lecture, he walked beside me across campus. Heads turned, students, professors, even staff. I could feel their eyes on my gray hair, my slow steps, my plain dress. But my grandson didn't rush ahead or hide in embarrassment. He held my arm proudly, steadying me over the uneven pavement, introducing me with confidence. "This is my grandmother," he told anyone who stopped to greet him. "She's the reason I'm here." The words melted something in me. For so long I had carried love like a hidden flame, unseen, unthanked. Now he was carrying it for me, out loud, for the world to hear. When the lecture ended, he guided me to the front steps of the building. A group of his friends stood nearby, the same boys who had once laughed when he mocked me. This time he faced them directly. "Do you remember when I joked about my grandma?" he asked them, his voice even. They chuckled awkwardly, unsure. He shook his head. "I was wrong. I was cruel. She's not just my grandmother. She's my hero. She paid my tuition. She sacrificed everything for me. And I'll never let anyone disrespect her again." The silence that followed wasn't mocking. It was reverent. Even his friends lowered their eyes, shuffling their feet, ashamed of the laughter they once shared. And me. I stood there, the sun warm on my face, my grandson's arm steady at my side, and I felt taller than I had in years. Later that night, as I sat by my window, I reflected. Age is not the enemy. Smells of lavender lotion, of roses in bloom, of old books kept too long on shelves, these are not curses. They are the scents of survival, the perfume of sacrifice, the fragrance of love stretched across decades. We live in a world that worships youth, that forgets the hands that built it. But I have learned this. Respect may falter, memory may fade, but truth always rises. And the truth is this. I was never just an old woman in the corner. I was the foundation. And when the foundation finally spoke, the house remembered who held it up. So if you are listening tonight, wondering if your sacrifices go unseen, wondering if your love has been forgotten, let me tell you, it has not. Time has a way of revealing what silence hides. And if you are young, full of pride, quick to laugh at the ones who raised you, remember this too. One day you will need someone to remember you with kindness. One day you will smell not of perfume but of years. And you will hope someone calls it love, not decay. As for me, I don't need flowers or applause. I just need to sit across from my grandson, watch him smile honestly, and know he sees me again. Because in the end it was never about the insult. It was about memory. And now he remembers. Beach Balloon, thank you for watching. Remember, family may hurt you but dignity always finds its way back. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more.